Jackson wasn't just the founder of Eris, he was its architect, its soul, the force behind every candlelit table and every carefully plated dish. Eris was known for its precision, its elegance, and most of all, its pride. That pride wasn't corporate. No, it was personal. Jackson built the empire, brick by brick, dish by dish, with the grit of a man who knew struggle more intimately than success. For years, nothing left the kitchen unless it passed through his hands. He was the heartbeat. But hearts can falter, and something, quietly but unmistakably, began to change. It started with numbers, discrepancies too small to raise alarms but too frequent to ignore. Inventory shifted, deliveries were off by just enough to feel wrong, and then came the whispers. Gentle, persistent, the kind that dance in hallways and stick in the air. He didn't panic. Jackson never panicked. He didn't call in auditors, he didn't make a scene, he simply disappeared from the glass towers and reappeared one floor beneath, unrecognizable, dressed in a faded security uniform. For 3 nights, he sat alone in a back room, colder than the walk-in freezer he used to clean with his own hands. No name on his shirt, no badge of honor, just silence. No one noticed. No one asked. Jackson watched the empire he once called a masterpiece, watched it breathe without him. And by the 3rd night, a decision settled like frost in his chest. This wasn't the place he built. This version wasn't worth saving. But just before leaving, a drawer long forgotten creaked open. Inside, a folded scrap of paper, soft with age, 12 words, handwritten and quiet, stared up at him like a whisper from the past. They weren't loud, but they reached deep, deep enough to stop his feet, deep enough to make him stay. Jackson hadn't been born with wealth or legacy. He didn't inherit recipes, restaurants, or reputations. At 28, he opened his first kitchen in the back of an alley no one dared to walk after dark. Second-hand pans, a borrowed oven, a heart full of fire. He cooked because he had to. He believed in food that spoke when words failed. He worked 18-hour days, sleeping on a bench behind the freezer when the last guest left. He mopped floors long after the servers clocked out. There were nights the power flickered, nights he had to choose between buying herbs or paying rent, but he kept going, not for luxury, but for love. And slowly word spread, not about elegance, but care. That care became a name, that name became Aros. Through it all, Jackson carried the struggle like a badge. He wore it in the lines on his palms, in the precision of his kitchen, in the way he folded napkins with more intention than most people gave their dreams. He never forgot what it meant to serve, not until success, like ivy, grew thick, tangled, and distant. Management layered itself between him and the stove. Investors clapped in rooms where he no longer spoke. He watched from far above as others ran what he had once tended like a garden, and with each passing day, the pulse of the place felt less like his own. The warmth faded. The chatter turned rehearsed. Something essential was slipping away. Then came the moment that tipped it all. It wasn't a fire, a theft, or a scandal. It was something quieter. Invoices that didn't line up. Wine cases that vanished, deliveries marked as paid but never signed for. Ingredient costs spiked without warning. Staff shifts logged without staff. Jackson buried himself in the reports. He circled numbers, asked soft questions, and received answers polished to a sheen, too polished. System error. Normal fluctuations. They told him everything was fine. But Jackson had lived too many nights in kitchens lit only by the oven light to believe in coincidences. This wasn't about profit. This was about something deeper. The truth, the quiet erosion of something honest, something sacred. He didn't accuse, didn't shout, but something cracked inside him, and once that line was crossed, he couldn't unsee it. He could have made calls, He could have fired half the staff, launched a high-profile audit, but none of that would have brought him closer to the truth. Truth, he believed, wasn't in numbers, it was in footsteps, in whispered conversations, in the way people moved when they thought no one was watching. So he told no one, not the board, not his assistant, not even his lawyer. He chose one location, the flagship, the place where Eris had earned its first star, the kitchen where he once burned his hand trying to save a sauce no one would remember. He asked for the night shift. No title, no press, just a name no one recognized and a security badge that didn't quite fit. He stepped into his own kingdom as a stranger. No fanfare, no chauffeur, no clipboard, just a folded uniform and a quiet resolve. The staff called him the new night guy. No one asked who he was. No one cared. That was exactly what he wanted. Odu? The man who went underground. He chose the corner room near the backloading dock. Cold floor, plastic chair, stale air. He needed discomfort. He needed honesty. He passed chefs in hallways, nodded once. They didn't look twice. Servers, managers, cleaners, all too busy to notice the ghost among them. He became invisible, and in that invisibility, he listened. Through a cracked door and a broken fan, he heard the kitchen again, not the curated version, but the real one. Jokes, complaints, swearing, stories. People speaking without filters because they thought no one was listening. And in those voices, Jackson found something more revealing than any audit. By 4 a.m., the restaurant fell quiet. Lights dimmed. Staff left, one by one. No goodbyes, no backward glances, just footsteps fading into silence. Jackson sat by the back window, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. Then he heard it. Engine noise. Too close. Too late. A truck backed into the loading bay. No lights, no paperwork. 2 men, fast and hushed, unloading crates. Sealed, heavy, unmarked. Boxes he didn't recognize. Boxes that had no reason to be leaving a restaurant at this hour. No clipboard, no signatures. Just silence. And for the first time in years, Jackson felt something stir. Not anger, not fear, but purpose. There was no shouting, no smashing of crates, just a nod, a silent agreement. And the truck pulled away, swallowed by the dark. Jackson didn't move. He didn't chase. He simply watched. Not out of fear, but with a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with surprise. This wasn't the shock of a revelation. It was the slow, sinking weight of confirmation. A truth he had tried not to name had just laid itself bare before him. He jotted down the license plate, the time, the faces, not with urgency, but with solemn clarity. He recognized the driver before he even saw the face. Dark gray jacket, clean cut, embroidered with the Eris emblem on the sleeve. That jacket had once meant something. Pride, belonging. Now it felt like a ghost of a promise. Jackson's breath caught as memory surged forward. That man, the driver, wasn't a stranger. He'd seen him in staff photos from years ago. A younger face then, holding a certificate, proud and smiling. One of their own. But now? Now he moved with the precision of someone who knew where the blind spots were. He didn't break in. He didn't sneak. He operated like a man in familiar territory. Trusted, undetected. And it wasn't just him. A chef emerged next, calm and casual, like it was any other chore. He carried 2 large black trash bags, heavy, sealed tightly at the top. Jackson knew the weight of those bags, knew the feel of truffle oil, the bulk of prime rib, the cool precision of imported cheeses. Signature ingredients meant for guests, not for a car trunk at 3 a.m. No rush, no whispers, no hesitation. They didn't exchange pleasantries or checklists, just the practiced efficiency of repetition. The trunk opened, the bags disappeared inside. The chef walked back like it never happened, and the driver, he never looked back. Jackson didn't move. His body was still, but his mind was burning. He didn't need to open those bags. He already knew. They weren't coming back. Not to a prep station. Not to a plate. They were gone, like so many pieces of this place had been over the years. Stolen. Not with force, but with familiarity. He reached into his coat and pulled out the same old notepad he'd once used to jot recipes and prep notes. Now it was a ledger of loss. He recorded everything, the faces, the time, the gestureless exchange. Each letter landed with the quiet weight of betrayal. Once he had taught his staff, when something feels wrong, write it down before you forget. Now here he was, taking his own advice in the ruins of what he built. There was no anger, at least not yet, just stillness, that deep, breathless kind of stillness that arrives before a storm. He folded the note, tucked it into his shirt pocket, and breathed deeply. No alarms, no confrontation, just silence, and the slow, rising tide of doubt, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. As he stepped into the hallway, the lights flickered overhead. Staff voices echoed through the quiet like static, laughter loose and unchecked. He lingered in a shadowed corner, unnoticed. Then a voice, young and sharp, pierced the air. "The old guard looks half dead," someone joked, laughter following like a cruel wave. No one corrected him. No one even lowered their voices. Jackson stood motionless. Not from pride, not from hurt, but because listening was all he had left. He had trained people like this, paid them, gave them chances, and now to them he was nothing more than a tired man in a cheap uniform. That cut deeper than the stolen goods, because it wasn't just an insult. It was the truth behind it that ached. The truth behind it that ached. He wasn't feared. He wasn't respected. He wasn't seen. And maybe, just maybe, that was why things had unraveled. On the second night, they gave him a simple task: clean the cold storage. Jackson didn't object. It gave him space to breathe, space to see. The freezer door creaked open, the cold air wrapping around him like a warning. He moved through the room, stacking boxes near the back. But something didn't feel right. The labels were off. Imported seafood marked as local catch, premium beef under cheaper tags. He peeled one sticker back, careful, methodical. Underneath, another label, crossed out in pen, a different supplier, a different story. This wasn't a mistake. It was a mask, a lie frozen in plain sight. And Jackson had seen tricks like this before, but never here, never in his kitchen. He stood there, box in hand, the frost clinging to his sleeves like guilt. The cold wasn't cold anymore. It was hollow, dishonest, foreign. Later, as he passed the side hallway, voices met him again, sharper this time. Not loud, but cutting. A server slammed her notepad down. "I'm not your servant, you arrogant prick," she hissed. Another voice joined in. "Table 4, entitled Trash." Laughter followed, bitter, mean. Jackson paused by the doorway. He didn't need to be seen. He just listened. They didn't whisper. They didn't care. Just the night guard passing through. Nameless. Powerless. But he remembered. Table 4. A young couple. New guests. Nervous, excited, kind. They'd smiled at every dish. Jackson had always said, "Respect the plate. Respect the person." Now that lesson had been reduced to mockery, not by enemies, but by his own. The soul of Eris, once a quiet symphony of craft and care, now felt gutted, replaced by something smaller, colder and disturbingly loud in its silence. Jackson stepped out back, hoping for a moment to clear his thoughts. The air was damp, heavy, but what he saw stopped him mid-step. Just outside the service door, a chef, still in uniform, stood casually with a bottle of vintage wine wrapped in a towel, one of their rarest, reserved for anniversaries or celebrations. Across from him stood a man in a dark coat, no name tag, no delivery bag, not staff, not a supplier, just a shadow in the night. They didn't speak. No handshake. No hesitation. The wine changed hands. An envelope returned. The chef tucked it into his apron like it was part of the routine, like it wasn't the first time, and certainly wouldn't be the last. Jackson didn't intervene, not because he was afraid, but because he understood. This wasn't about a bottle. It was about the slow, deliberate erosion of everything he had built. Not a collapse, but a quiet decay, the kind that spreads in corners where no one's watching, the kind that starts with forgetting what something once stood for. By the second night, he'd stopped expecting eye contact. He held open doors, no thank yous. He greeted 3 people, none responded. He walked past the line cooks, and they didn't glance up from their phones. He used to command rooms with presence alone. Now, he was invisible, a shadow with a mob. It wasn't pride that hurt. It was the revelation that culture isn't sustained by mission statements or framed slogans. It lives and dies in the everyday gestures, how people treat those they think don't matter. And to them, he didn't matter. Not anymore. Back in the security room, the air felt heavier than ever. The walls closed in, stale and thin. Jackson pulled out his notebook, not for observations, but for decisions. His pen trembled slightly as he began a letter. It was direct, final. A request to shut the location down, not suspend it, not investigate, close it. But he documented everything: stolen goods, false labels, silent betrayals. But between the lines was something deeper. Grief, a mourning of what Arus had become. This place had once been sacred to him. Now, it felt hollow, unrecognizable. He didn't rush. Each sentence was deliberate, each word carrying the weight of disappointment and disillusionment. When he finished, he didn't sign it. Not yet. He folded the letter and set it beside him on the desk, the final line left blank. For a long moment, he just stared at it. He could have signed, he almost did, but something held his hand back. Not hope, not confusion. Something quieter. A voice inside him whispered, "Wait. Watch one more night." Even now, betrayed and broken, he still wanted to understand. Not just what had gone wrong, but why. Maybe, just maybe, there was something worth salvaging in the shadows. So, he left the letter unsigned. He slid it under the desk, closed his notebook, and stood again. Keelan, one more night. At 1 a.m., he returned to the loading dock. Same place, same stillness, but this time, a new kind of wrong unfolded. The company van pulled out. No delivery logs, no paperwork, but inside, loud music, bass thumping, and the unmistakable laugh of the driver from before. Beside him, a woman in a red dress, clearly not staff, clearly not working. They sped off into the night, headlights slicing through the rain. No concern, no accountability, just joyriding in a branded vehicle like it was their personal escape car. Jackson didn't reach for his pen. He didn't write anything. He just stood there, stunned. Not by theft, but by how normalized the disrespect had become. Then, a soft click behind him, the service door. He turned to re-enter, but the handle wouldn't budge. Lucked out, Rain began to fall, slow and steady, soaking through his sleeves, seeping into his shoes. He knocked. Once. Then again. No answer. He stood, not out of stubbornness, but because deep down, he knew. No one was coming. Laughter spilled faintly through the wall. Music. Life continued inside. Without him. He waited 30 minutes. Not a single face checked the door. Not a single thought spared for the old man outside in the rain. The same man who had once sworn that no staff of his would ever feel forgotten. Yet here he was. Not invisible because they didn't know him. Invisible because they didn't care. By 2 a.m. the kitchen pulsed with bass. Someone had hooked up a speaker. 2 staff members danced near the prep station, aprons tossed aside, hair down, rules forgotten. One slipped in a puddle of oil and laughed like it was a prank. The grill still burned. Dishes sat half-scrubbed, tickets unmarked. There were no standards, just noise. Jackson stood in the hallway, just out of view, watching flowers from a neglected garnish tray scatter beneath careless steps. No one noticed. Or worse, they noticed and simply didn't care. This wasn't rebellion. It wasn't chaos. It was routine, and that terrified him more than anything else. He remembered the early days, when every shift had rhythm, when the kitchen was a place of discipline, respect, precision. Now, it felt like a party thrown over a grave, loud, wild, oblivious to the death beneath their feet. He found a corner near dry storage, sat down, quiet, unmoving, just another coat draped over a forgotten chair. Inside, 3 staff leaned near the shelves, voices low, but not low enough. And of weak stock? Their words would be next. "I moved half of it already," one voice muttered, casual as a grocery list. That's easy money. No one checks those numbers," another added, laughing. The sound was light, almost cheerful, like they were talking about scoring free coffee, not stealing from the house that fed them. "Call it bonus pay," the third said. "We're just helping the system breathe." They weren't whispering. They weren't hiding. They spoke like it was part of the job, like theft had been woven into their shift schedule, like the company somehow owed them this. Their tone wasn't rebellious, it was entitled. One of them opened a bag of expired truffle pasta. Untouched, unsalvageable, yet still valuable. "Sold this for 40, she bragged, popping it open like a trophy. "Didn't even ask questions." Jackson closed his eyes, not to tune it out, but to etch it into memory. Every word, every arrogant syllable. He didn't just hear the crime, he felt the pride behind it. That was what hit deepest. They were sure no one was listening. No one that mattered. They were wrong. Nearby, in the break room, a manager leaned back in his chair, feet kicked up like a king in a forgotten kingdom. "If we ever got caught," he said with a smirk, "please." That old guard couldn't hear a fire alarm. Laughter, not anxious, not guilty, confident. Another voice chimed in. "He's half asleep most nights anyway." Jackson stood in the hallway, motionless, still as the shadows. They didn't whisper. They didn't check for ears, because in their minds, he didn't exist. They didn't mock him for what he'd done. They mocked him for who they thought he was. A relic. A ghost in a uniform. Someone safe to ignore. Jackson didn't flinch. He didn't step forward. He just pulled out his notebook, the same one he'd carried through decades of service and sweat. He dated the page. He wrote down their words, every quote, line by line, without embellishment or emotion. His hands were steady, his face unreadable. When he finished, he folded the notes and tucked them into his coat. Then, quietly, he gathered his things. A thermos, a jacket, a broken watch that hadn't ticked in years. Everything he brought in, he took out. No one turned to see him go. And in that silence, Jackson realized something. He wasn't surprised anymore. Not angry, not shocked. Just hollow. The kind of hollow that comes after years of watching something slide downhill, too slow to stop, too familiar to fear. This wasn't a fall. It was erosion. And tonight, it had finally reached the bottom. By morning, Jackson sat at his desk. No uniform, no clipboard, just a plain envelope and a decision he'd made in the quiet of his own heart. He opened the notebook one last time and pulled out the letter he had drafted days ago. The one he had hesitated to sign. Not anymore. His pen moved slowly, each stroke heavy with years. Inside the envelope he placed two things: his formal resignation from daily operations and a request to close the flagship location indefinitely. He didn't name names, he didn't need to. The truth lived in the pages. He sealed the envelope and pressed his thumb along the fold, not with anger, but with something more solemn. Some endings need to be written by the person who started it all. As he reached for his coat, he paused. Something pulled him back. An instinct. A feeling. He glanced at the old drawer by his chair, one he hadn't touched in 3 nights. It stuck slightly, then slid open. Inside, dust, a broken pen, and a small folded note. No envelope, no name. Just paper, creased and worn, like it had been opened many times by someone who read it for comfort. Jackson hesitated, then picked it up. There was no perfume. No company logo. Just faded ink and slow, careful handwriting. 12 words. 12 soft human words that stopped him in his tracks. Thank you for watching over our sleep, sir. No request, no praise, no drama. Just acknowledgement. He read it again. Then again. And then, without thinking, he sat down. The room didn't get warmer. It didn't shine. But something shifted. Less empty. Less forgotten. He imagined someone, maybe after a long shift, maybe with sore feet and tired eyes, writing those words with no agenda, no audience, just kindness. In 3 nights, Jackson had heard every flavor of arrogance, entitlement, and decay. But this was the first voice that felt real. It didn't erase the damage, but it cracked through the noise. He turned the note over, blank, no signature, no clue. But the handwriting was familiar, slightly slanted, careful, the kind written by someone who never wastes paper, who writes because they mean every word. Then it clicked. Rosa, the night cleaner. Mid-50s, quiet, reliable, never late, never loud. She swept floors no one noticed, wiped counters no one thanked her for. Refilled soap like it mattered. He remembered passing her once. She smiled. He nodded. That was it. And now this note. Not from a manager, not from a chef. From someone who saw him. Not the uniform, not the silence, but the person inside. He held the note like it was glass, not because it was fragile, but because it meant something, more than he expected, more than anyone could have guessed. 3 nights had left him numb. But this one act, this whisper of appreciation, thawed something in him. Not because it fixed everything, but because it reminded him why he'd built it all in the first place. Jackson leaned back. He didn't feel tired anymore. He felt seen, and in that soft flicker of grace, he understood. There was still something worth saving. Maybe not the building, maybe not the name, But the people, the ones who cared in silence, who noticed without being noticed, Rosa had spoken the softest, but she'd said the most. And for the first time in a long time, Jackson let himself feel it. Not grief, not regret, but quiet, necessary hope. As Jackson sat back in his chair, the final piece of the puzzle slid quietly into place. Each morning that week, he'd found a small piece of bread on the desk, wrapped in a napkin, still warm, always with a note in the same slow, careful handwriting. "This is for you, sir." At the time, he assumed it was a leftover from the kitchen, a quiet gesture from no one in particular, a courtesy, an afterthought. But now he knew. Rosa, not for praise, not for attention, just care, thoughtful, quiet care from someone who had noticed the bags under his eyes, the untouched dinners, the way he sat a little too still. It wasn't about bread. It never was. It was about being seen. Not as a founder, not as a failure, not as a title with a cracked legacy. Just as a man. Jackson held Rosa's note like something breakable. Gently, reverently, he folded it and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, close to his chest. Then he looked over at the envelope, the one that contained his resignation, the one that, until moments ago, had felt like the only path forward. He didn't rip it up. He didn't rewrite it. He just left it. Not because the problems had vanished, but because someone, one person, had reminded him of why he had started this journey in the first place. And with that one act of human kindness, not everything felt lost. He stood quietly, his hands no longer trembling. For the first time in days, he wasn't moving from anger or grief. He was moving from choice. He would stay, not to save the brand, not to punish the guilty, but to begin again, to rebuild, not from boardrooms or buzzwords, but from the quiet corners where the good had never left. The next morning, Jackson made one call, a message to every team lead, full staff meeting, noon, no exceptions. Whispers ignited like wildfire. People asked questions. Some were nervous, most confused. No one had seen Jackson in weeks. Until now. At exactly 12 o'clock, the dining room filled. Chefs, servers, dishwashers, drivers, everyone in uniform. Some seated, most stood. Then Jackson walked in. No disguise, no security badge, just himself. He fell into a deep, breathless. A few faces went pale. Some looked away. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't carry notes. He simply looked around the room and let the silence work. Then he spoke. "I was here for 3 nights, he said, his voice even, clear. You didn't know it, but I saw everything." The room froze. "And now," he continued, "we're going to talk about what this place has become and what it needs to be again." Jackson stepped forward, not as a boss, but as a man who had once bled in this very kitchen. "I'm not a guard," he said. "I'm not a temp. I'm not a consultant. I'm Jackson Ward." Gasps rippled. One server dropped her pen. A manager looked at the floor. "I built this place," he said. "Not with inheritance, not with luck, with sweat, with time, with care." His tone never shifted, but the weight of each word pressed heavy. "For 3 nights I watched my own house rot, and for 3 nights I waited for someone, anyone, to say something true." He paused. He didn't name names. Not yet. This moment wasn't about blame. It was about truth. "For 3 nights I walked these halls like a ghost. I stood in your break rooms, sat in your silence, heard the jokes, saw the backdoor deals, waited in the rain, and no one noticed." He wasn't looking for perfection. He was looking for decency. "For the work," he said. "For each other. The room stayed silent, but this time it was a listening kind of silence. Then came the reckoning. Jackson listed 4 names, printed, not spoken. Their contracts terminated. No fanfare, no spectacle. Not vengeance. Missed boundaries. Then a second list, longer. Staff who would stay, but not unchanged. Each one called in, each one warned. This was their new line. 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 Some nodded, eyes low. Others didn't speak. But they all knew things wouldn't go back. Jackson had arrived as a ghost. But he wouldn't leave as one. This wasn't punishment. This was restoration. Whispered then, softly. Rosa. Heads turned. She blinked from the corner, startled, her cleaning gloves still on. She hadn't spoken, hadn't moved. But now, every eye in the room found her. She stepped forward slowly, unsure, shoulders drawn in, hands folded tight. Jackson nodded. You reminded me, he said, of what this place once stood for. She tilted her head, confused. You saw what others didn't. You gave when no one asked. You reached without shouting. She didn't answer, because kindness like hers doesn't know what to say in moments like these. Jackson reached into his coat, pulled out a second letter. This is for you, he said. He handed her a simple envelope. Inside, a new role. Rosa Alvarez, night supervisor and cultural representative. No long speech, no dramatic reveal. You've been watching over this place long before I ever did, he said. Now it's time people knew that. Gasps. A few tears. But Rosa didn't cry. She held the envelope close, like it was something sacred. It wasn't about the promotion. It was about being seen. And in that moment, respect filled the room. Quietly, deeply. No one needed to clap, because they felt it. In the end, it wasn't a policy that saved the place. Not punishment. Not power. It was a folded note. A piece of bread. A woman who worked in silence and gave without being asked. After everyone left, Jackson stood alone again, but this time, not invisible. He looked around the empty dining room. Thought of what it had been, and what it still could be. Then he whispered softly to himself. It wasn't power that held this place together. It was quiet kindness. And somehow that was enough to begin again.